Welcome to the Chain Reaction Podcast, brought to you by the Department of Supply Chain Management at Arizona State University's W.P. Carey School of Business. With a rotating cast of faculty, alumni, industry experts, and guest contributors. This podcast aims to help listeners understand the people and processes that produce and distribute products around the world. In today's session, Supply Chain Management Professor Chris Lee discusses recent supply chain public policy initiatives as outlined by President Biden in his February 7, 2023 State of the Union address, and how these policies aim to lead to a more robust and resilient supply chain. The podcast concludes with an interview examining supply chain backgrounds, the W.P. Carey student experience, and recent trends in the supply chain management industry. Hello and welcome. My name is Chris Lee. I am a professor of supply chain management here at the W.P. Carey School of Business at Arizona State University. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the Biden administration's State of the Union address, especially how it applies to increasing our supply chain capacity here in the United States. One of my main focus areas in research is in public policy and how those policies can increase efficiencies in supply chains, assist with increased manufacturing ability, and increased resilience within our supply chains. So thank you for joining me for this. President Joe Biden's February 7th, 2023 State of the Union address came out almost 2 years after his executive order on America's supply chains. During his State of the Union, President Biden outlined a number of initiatives in supply chains here in the United States and international partnerships, and discussed a number of the policies that he and his administration had put into place and what they were hoping for the future. In this short presentation, I'm going to examine that original executive order and the 100-day report that came out of that. I'm also going to take a look at where things are moving in the future. Obviously, this is just a high-level, short presentation on these issues, but with any luck, this will lead to an understanding of what is being done now to buttress the American supply chain, increase efficiencies and resilience, and take a good stock of what we have learned in the last number of years due to supply chain disruptions such as COVID-19, the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, issues with globalization and unstable governments, etc. So thank you for joining me for this presentation. So what I plan on covering in examining America's supply chain is first the original executive order that Joe Biden had released on February 24th, 2021, just shortly after a month of the beginning of his administration, Executive Order 14017. I'm then going to look at the 100-day American Supply Chain Report that came out of this executive order. It was one of the requirements within it and kind of laid the groundwork of what was going to be done to begin rebuilding a more efficient supply chain here in the United States and with our partners internationally, and also making sure that the supply chain was resilient and could meet the demands of an ever-increasing number of supply chain disruptions. I'm going to utilize the CHIPS and Science Act just briefly to draw some ideas of how the executive order and the various reports that came out of it have helped to revigorate the semiconductor industry here in the United States of America, and how that could be utilized as a starting point for developing new capacity in existing industry here in the United States when it comes to our supply chain. And then I'm going to finish off just talking about the next steps. Part of the executive order called for a 1-year developed plan, a year after the original executive order. And I want to take a look at how that might then lead to more efficiency within supply chains here in the United States and abroad, and how it will lead possibly to more resilience across multiple industries and sectors here in the United States. When President Biden released his executive order on America's supply chains, we were already in the midst of dealing with COVID-19, a number of supply chain disruptions, a lack of ability to source many things, including medical supplies, masks, food items, shortages across the country, and we were beginning to see that a lot of our decision making when it came to a global-centric supply chain may not have been the best approach in certain areas. In the executive order, he established a new policy for examining how to run our supply chain here in the United States moving forward. Wanted to establish some coordination between various government agencies to ensure a more reliant and resilient supply chain. Wanted a 100-day review to be established after the executive order, basically to present the findings of the analysis of where we were at that moment and what steps we needed to take to make the supply chain here in the United States more viable and to avoid the impact of disruptions moving forward. And then he utilized his sectoral supply chain assessments, his various secretaries of government agencies, to examine individually how their agency had been impacted or what steps they could take to avoid future impacts when it came to their supply chains or their requirements within supply chains here in the United States for their various agencies. And then finally, it was a general review and recommendation requirement for this executive order that then led to the 1 year out plan for reestablishing a predominance here in the United States for ensuring supply chains were vibrant and we were able to continue to invest in manufacturing, proper sourcing, and ensure that we were not running into issues of low supply. So from a policy perspective, what exactly was outlined by this executive order? Well, first, the United States needs to be resilient, diverse, and secure supply chains to ensure our economic prosperity and national security is part of what the executive order stated. On the surface, this seems like a no-brainer in many ways. But economic development both here in the United States, domestically, and internationally had led to a number of coalitions and larger organizations running huge aspects of various industries' supply chains, almost to the point of having a monopoly on them, which meant if a factory went down in China, there was a good chance you could not get the supplies you needed back here in the United States once that had been outsourced. And so this was seen as a issue in maintaining the secure supply chain here domestically. Next was dealing with supply chain disruptions. I speak in my classes constantly over the fact that there has been at least one supply chain disruption every year, if not more than one, in the last 20 plus years. And so we always know that there's a disruption coming. We just don't know what that disruption is going to be. It could be a pandemic like COVID-19 was, some kind of biological threat. Cyber attacks are on the rise and always an issue. Climate shocks, extreme weather stopping our ability to transport goods and supplies. Terrorist attacks. 9/11 is not that long ago in all reality, and we continue to see issues worldwide when it comes to terrorist attacks. Geopolitical unrest. We see regimes rise and fall, and often we are utilizing those geographical areas for sourcing materials. And then various economic competition, as we've mentioned, companies getting together as one, basically the monopolizing of the industries, and then other conditions that can often add to some kind of issue in things like manufacturing. For instance, the latest issues in not being able to find employees in industry, and that whole supply chain of labor, which is becoming a larger issue over time. And then finally, the policy was to revitalize and rebuild domestic manufacturing capacity. The outsourcing and offshoring phenomenon due to globalization led to a number of American companies outsourcing or offshoring their domestic manufacturing. So outsourcing manufacturing to foreign companies or offshoring their particular production facilities that they owned to lower labor cost markets, which has led to a weaker domestic manufacturing capacity here in the United States. And while that worked quite well for a number of years, depending on what you were trying to source and what you needed, we have learned that the reliability of being able to continue to source in that way, if there is a factory shutdown in China, for instance, is not sustainable moving forward if we want to be both efficient and resilient in our sourcing of materials and also in our manufacturing. Now, part of what the executive order lays out is the facilitating of greater domestic production, a range of supply, built-in redundancies, adequate stockpiles, safe and secure digital networks, and a world-class American manufacturing base and workforce. All of these things are important. Part of the issue when we didn't have redundancies, different areas that we could source either finished goods or raw materials from, we were stuck in a single source idea. We also have to revisit that idea of having proper stockpiles. What are our forecasts of requirement and demand? What do we need in the way of materials, source components, and finished goods? This also doesn't necessarily mean that we need to go to that single nation idea. Part of this also outlines a close cooperation on resilient supply chains with allied partners who share our same approach to economic development and requirements when it comes to safety standards, etc. The interesting part of this policy for America's supply chains is that it ties both national and economic security together in many ways. Having spent a number of years in the military, just over 20 now, doing logistics and supply chain for the Navy and for the Army, still attached to the Navy, one thing that was incredibly clear was how important it is to be able to get the supplies you need when you need them. And while we often look at the Department of Defense as a national security protection and therefore war entity, the DoD is also on the front lines of dealing with any international and domestic disaster. And so having allies we can rely on to assist in those instances, coming up with some sort of agreed upon standards, and then coordinating our efforts will be paramount to a viable supply chain, both domestically and internationally, moving forward. Now, for coordination, the Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and the Assistant to the President for Economic Policy have been identified. As I've already mentioned, tying both national security affairs and economic policy together, understanding the two often go hand in hand when it comes to protecting such things as supply chains and the availability of sources, materials, products, etc., I think is incredibly important. And part of the requirement is also to consult with outside stakeholders, so industry, universities, non-government organizations, both domestically and internationally, to utilize best practices and to ensure the proper establishment of a viable and vibrant supply chain moving forward. From an analysis standpoint, a 100-day review was required as part of this. And the Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of Energy, Secretary of Defense, and Secretary of Health and Human Services were all required to provide recommendations on how best to improve supply chains within their various sectors. And so, for instance, the Secretary of Commerce was asked to identify risks in semiconductor manufacturing and advanced packaging supply chains and policy recommendations to address those risks. The Secretary of Defense was asked to identify risks in supply chain for critical minerals and other identified strategic materials, including rare earth elements. 4 major secretaries had to look at their supply chain capabilities and come up with an assessment of where things stood. Included the Secretary of Defense, that was required to do an assessment of manufacturing for the defense industry. Secretary of Health and Human Services, that had to look at preparedness for various health risks moving forward. Secretary of Commerce and the Secretary of Homeland Security, in conjunction, looked into possible threats into the information and communication technology industry, dealing with supply chain risks and possible risks to the supply chain in the cyber community. And then the Secretary of Energy examined risks to the energy sector when it came to such things as manufacturing and transportation. The report submitted on the current status of supply chains here in the United States and what was necessary to make them more viable and resilient included the analysis of critical goods and materials, essential goods and materials, manufacturing capabilities, the defense of the supply chain, and planning for disruptions within the supply chain, and determining the capacity for resilience within the supply chain itself. So quite the ambitious plan laid out by the President in his executive order on America's supply chains. And for the 100-day report, they ended up having at least 4 major things change that then led to what was able to be reported at the State of the Union here in 2023. Of those, the first had to do with the expansion of vaccine manufacturing as part of the administration's COVID-19 response, drastically expanding the manufacture of vaccines and other essential supplies, and enabling more than 137 million Americans to get fully vaccinated. At this point in 2021, COVID-19 was of a major concern, and being able to ramp up manufacturing and the logistics of delivery was of paramount importance. And it showed that the administration had been taking very good steps in attempting to address that situation. The next was semiconductor manufacturing. There had been quite the delay in getting semiconductors for a whole bunch of products, from automobiles to consumer goods. Issue for this had to do with the fact that a lot of semiconductor manufacturing was now outsourced or offshored, not as much here in the United States. And so part of the proposal within 100 days was the administration working with companies to manufacture and use semiconductor chips here in the United States, increase manufacturing capabilities and facilities to be able to deal with that. This would ultimately lead to the Chips and Science Act of 2022. As part of the Department of Defense's review on supply chain issues, they were able to announce an investment in the expansion of the largest rare earth element mining and processing company outside of China to provide the raw materials necessary to help combat the climate crisis. The Department of Defense has long seen climate change as a national security threat and global security threat. And then finally, looking at cyber vulnerability analysis. A number of supply chain disruptions can be tracked right down to that idea of cyber attacks and changing of such things as manifests on ships. And so as part of that 100-day report back, trying to shore up those cyber vulnerabilities was a key consideration in improving the supply chain here in the United States. And this brings us full circle back to the 2023 State of the Union, where we can see what was implemented in a 2-year period to address America's supply chain issues, disruptions, and some might even say the crisis. The policies that have been implemented in that 2-year period, and the further steps that were being taken to build a more reliant and resilient supply chain here in the United States. So, first off, supported domestic production of critical medicines, ensuring that we were not relying on foreign manufactured medicines, especially with shipping issues and supply sourcing issues, factory close downs, etc. An end-to-end domestic supply for advanced batteries, sustainable domestic and international critical minerals production, again tying back to part of what the Department of Defense had already been looking into, building a fair and sustainable industrial base here in the United States and with partners globally, support for American workers and innovation, bringing back more manufacturing to the United States so there was not as much of a reliance on importing goods and materials. And then investing in sustainable supply chains here at home and abroad to ensure that source materials were always available. And combating unfair trade practices that cause further disruptions in the supply chain. So what are some of the policies that President Biden outlined in the State of the Union to address supply chain disruptions and improve the American supply chain? Well, he brought up the Buy America program, aimed at creating a standard to require all construction materials used in federal infrastructure projects be made in America, such as lumber, glass, drywall, and fiber optics cables. He discussed the $1.9 trillion infrastructure bill and how it will be used to improve roads, bridges, air and seaports, and provide broadband internet connection across the country so that we can better track source materials and goods as they move across the supply chain. He discussed a resilient supply chain being created by these investments in infrastructure and investments in better manufacturing techniques, leading to the cutting-edge production techniques being used here in the United States, again taking the United States to a leading position in manufacturing and innovation. He discussed the Chips and Science Act and some of the byproducts of the act, such as Intel's upcoming plant in Licking County, Ohio. He discussed how the Inflation Reduction Act again put a emphasis on ensuring that goods, and he discussed how the Inflation Reduction Act was aimed at increasing our supply chain resilience and dealing with disruptions within the supply chain and the economic impacts of those disruptions. Well, President Biden's State of the Union address just touches on the high-level policies aimed at building a better supply chain. It also reveals the importance federal policy plays in addressing supply chain disruptions and ensuring a resilient supply chain for the future of organizations, workers, and consumers. Well, thank you for joining me for this brief presentation. As you can tell, this just scratches the surface on the recent federal policies to increase our supply chain capacity, manufacturing, and supply chain resilience to make us more viable here in a 21st century approach to supply chains, both domestically and internationally. A number of the things that I touched on today will be spoken about in much more detail by my colleagues in future podcast presentations. But again, I want to thank you for joining me. The podcast concludes with an interview examining supply chain backgrounds, the WP Carey student experience, and recent trends in the supply chain management industry.
All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Nathaniel. I am a junior at Arizona State University's WP Carey School of Business. I'll be graduating in the May of 2024. I'm currently studying supply chain management as well as business data analytics. I am here today with Professor Chris Lee, faculty in the supply chain department. We're here today to really get a better understanding of the faculty perspective on student engagement in the supply chain management major, talk a little bit about why supply chain management is so interesting and why it's a great major for us students to pursue in 2023. So with that, I'd like to start off with the first question, Professor Lee, just giving us a little bit more background on yourself. Could you tell us a little bit about your educational and professional experience prior to ASU, as well as what motivated you to transition from your career to teaching supply chain management at ASU?
Perfect. Well, hey, thank you, Nathaniel, for that question and for asking me this. I always knew I wanted to teach at a university going back to my days at York University in Toronto in my 20s. I just didn't want to go about it from the idea of teaching theory. And so I thought, if I go into the real world, get some experiences, I can then use that in my teaching experience. And so my undergraduate degree was history and English. I ran restaurants for 25 years, started like many to pay my bills when I was in college, and just found that was a great management career. We didn't call it supply chain management at that point. It was just part of what we were doing to make a business work. And then I also, after 9/11, joined the U.S. military in the Navy and ended up doing logistics, working with mainly with the Army, but in a joint capacity. That kind of gave me a logistics background, and I got to see the world and see a bunch of different ports. And that inevitably led me into understanding that perspective from a global side of things. My graduate study was in business and political science and policy. And so I like to bring that into my courses. And then like many of us in the supply chain management department, we kind of all bring a bunch of different cross-disciplinary ideas and experiences into now teaching in this relatively newer discipline from a university standpoint. And that brought me into the supply chain management department. And I love the fact that I can use my historical background and my policy background and bring those in to kind of paint a picture and tell a story when I teach my classes.
Absolutely. No, I really appreciate you sharing that with us, Professor Lee. What I'm most excited about with these interviews is just hearing all of the different backgrounds from our professors, because of course you get a brief overview in class, but not quite as in-depth as that. So really appreciate that.
Sure.
Moving forward, our next question is going to be, what feedback have you received from employers regarding student readiness for their careers post-graduation? And then is there anything you've noticed while teaching that students could improve upon prior to graduating and entering their professional careers?
Sure. Well, all of the employers that we talk to that come to the career events and then also help us with case studies and guest lecturing, all tell us that they love how well prepared our ASU supply chain students are upon graduation and how well-rounded they are. And the fact that many of them have a secondary discipline that they've also added, like your data analytics or sustainability is another popular one at this point. And they all like to kind of see that. Things that I think are important outside of that to concentrate on is that creative thinking and that openness to new ideas and new approaches. Myself, I'm a lifelong learner. I continue to take additional courses just to get additional information. I'm always trying to pull different things in from different industries and everything that I'm doing. And so that idea of still having that childlike wonderment of new stuff coming up, like the AI, certain processes in understanding how to utilize technology in tracking shipments, in being able to do forecasting, in helping us with all those kind of ideas in supply chain management, I think is incredibly important. And then curiosity, I think is incredibly important regardless of your career, to try to get to know people outside of your industry or your profession, because this cross-pollination that happens is always very, very important for new ideas and new approaches. And so having that curiosity where reach out to people and go and have coffee with them. When you first start your job at a new company or you're doing an internship, get to know people both within the supply chain system at that organization itself, but also outside of that, accounting, finance, marketing. Get to know what they're doing to kind of get a bigger sense of the culture of that organization. I think those are skills that are very, very important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Fantastic, Professor Lee. Awesome. That's some incredible insight. To give some background into our next question here, I want to briefly introduce the ASU Supply Chain Management Association. I've been heavily involved with the Supply Chain Management Association, or SCMA, as you'll hear me refer to it. I've been heavily involved with SCMA since my freshman year. I joined the executive board my second semester freshman year and have been on that ever since. SCMA is an organization of over 500 student members here at ASU. Our mission is really to bridge the gap between the professional world of supply chain management and then the students of supply chain management here at ASU, whether that's through general meetings, site tours, case competitions, career fairs, conferences. We really do it all through many capacities, just trying to create opportunity for students at ASU to develop professionally. And so my question to you, Professor Lee, is from a faculty perspective, why do you feel that it is so important for the SCM students here at ASU to become involved with ASU SCMA, and how do you see it adding value to a student's education here in WP Carey?
Sure. Well, and that's an excellent question, Nathaniel. All of business is networking at the end of the day. Like many things, who you know is very, very important. The other thing is you will learn from different people, different approaches they've taken, and what has worked and hasn't worked. And in many ways, it'll save you some of the pain they might have gone through. And so for me, the benefit is that networking, that ability to have access to companies and organizations that assist with the SCMA, faculty participating in certain things that can talk about some of their industry experience outside of the classroom. That is often helpful. But I think the most important part is that community among yourself as students within the organization, where you can assist in mentoring junior students. You can utilize some of your knowledge to help set them along the right way. And then you always have those connections on things like LinkedIn moving forward. And so if you find that your friend Johnny from one of your courses has a job at Boeing and you're looking to get into that, you've already got that connection because you've been part of the SCMA, and you can reach out to them via LinkedIn to help.
Absolutely. I always like to say the community, ASU is massive. However, the communities are very small. And so I've always been a big supporter of SCMA. I think it's the best thing I ever did for myself joining my freshman year. It's provided me with so many opportunities for growth, both professionally, academically, whatever it is.
Sure.
I really thank myself so much every single day that I did take that leap and join SCMA my freshman year, even though it was a little bit overwhelming. I maybe felt like I didn't have that experience yet. I wasn't even enrolled in a supply chain class, but it really
Right.
did help me to find that community and find people that had already taken those classes to help me moving forward through my career as a student here at ASU. So I'm huge on ASU SCMA. If anyone has any questions about SCMA, feel free to reach out to me or
Well,
Professor Lee, of course.
and being on the board gives you a chance to do some of that project management and event management and other activities that just look so wonderful on a resume to employers. And again, it goes back to W.P. Carey's idea of business being personal, and you get to see that personal, fun aspect of this. And I think that's also incredibly important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree. All right. Moving into our next question. And this is a pretty broad question, but I think it's good to sort of give especially younger students maybe a couple skills or skill sets to focus on developing, in these next couple years of their time at ASU or even couple months. But the question is, what combination of skills makes a great supply chain student or professional in 2023?
I think the thing is, again, going back to that openness, that curiosity, that willingness to try to look at things from a different angle, and understanding that you're not going to know everything right off the bat. Asking questions to be able to build solutions. And yeah, again, with the SCMA and other things, you've got some of these skill sets of being able to bring other people's voices in, that diversity of ideas in decision making. The other thing I always like to bring up in my logistics class is in the last 20 years, there's been a supply chain disruption annually every year, more than that now. But if we just look at the last 20 years, there's always been a supply chain disruption, sometimes 2 or 3. So we know there's always going to be a disruption of some kind. We may not know what that supply chain disruption is going to be, but we can plan for that disruption and have that creative thinking and critical thinking being utilized and applied. And then understanding a lot of the technology that we use for, as I said earlier, tracking shipments, forecasting, figuring out what may or may not be a commodity or supply that's going to have an issue, much like the soft lumber issue a couple years ago with home building and getting soft lumber from Canada. Foreseeing some of those things and coming up with contingency plans and utilizing some of the software and computer analysis systems that we have for assisting in that, in making those decisions. And then never be afraid to say that you're not sure of a certain answer, and never be afraid to continue to work on your learning once you graduate. That's not the end of the journey. That to me is the beginning. As I touched on earlier, I continue to take college courses to get more knowledge and to continue to try to be as up to date as possible on what's going on in the world. And I think it's important to take that lifelong learning curiosity mindset and have that as a skill.
Absolutely. I love what you said there as far as it's okay to not have an answer or to not be certain about a question. I've always tried to live with the mindset of, I may not have the answer, but I think I know someone who might, and I can reach out to them and then get back with you and that sort of a thing. And just being humble and, it helps you to learn more, and just always being willing to learn and being adaptive. I think that's so important, especially in supply chain. You're majoring in supply chain, you better be adaptive, be ready to switch, pivot as soon as it's needed, and, accomplish that next task that's set in front of you. And so I love a lot of what you just said. So perfect.
In the military, we used to joke Semper Gumby, which basically Gumby being the rubber green character from many years ago. And the whole idea of being able to be agile and adaptive and understand, hey, whatever your plan was an hour ago, it's probably changed. And so be able to pivot. And I think that's very, very important as well.
Yes.
Yeah, great point.
Absolutely. So moving into our final question for today. as a student at ASU, one thing I've noticed is that whether I'm applying for maybe scholarships within WP Carey or external third-party scholarships, some student organizations may require this or MBA programs, maybe post-graduation, but the topic is recommendation letters. So my question to you, Professor Lee, is would you write a recommendation letter for any student? And then on top of that, how would you recommend students develop a more personal connection with faculty?
Sure. So I'm always open to writing letters of recommendation for students that I have seen, are excelling, that definitely are the, top-notch candidates for jobs or for graduate school. But I need to know you. I need to have worked with you. I need you to have shown up to my office hours. I need you to be speaking in my classes. And seeing you maybe take the lead on some of the team projects that we are big on doing. And another thing that I always require students to do with me is meet with me for 15 minutes at the beginning of the semester so I can get to know you a little bit better and understand what your passions are. So I can maybe add some of that to the course that I'm teaching to change it up a little bit and understand what you're looking to accomplish. So if I hear of a possible internship or a job that fits the industry you're looking to get into with your supply chain career, that I can help connect those dots. But I think it's very important to take advantage of those opportunities. If I don't know you and I try to write a letter of recommendation for you, my recommendation doesn't hold any weight. And I want to make sure my recommendation holds weight because I want you to get into the job you want or the graduate program you want to get into. And so that would be my recommendation is show up to office hours. Take the time to get to know and work with your professors. Work on some of the projects that maybe that they mentioned to you that they're working on when it comes to research or other activities. Be part of the SCMA and be there for events where you're seeing faculty are there so they can see what you're like in those kind of environments. And then I think that leads to a much stronger recommendation, definitely, but certainly a sense that that recommendation will hold weight. And so when you have opportunities to be around your faculty outside of the classroom, please do it.
Absolutely. No, those are all great about moving forward. And all of us as students, our academic careers, as we do get to, needing those recommendation letters for whatever it is that we're applying for, we'll at least know what to think about and what we should be doing ahead of time, in the month leading up to needing that recommendation letter, because you can't just kind of cram it into one day before it's due. So perfect. We really appreciate that insight, Professor Lee. And on top of that, I think, so that was my final question for today. Professor Lee, I just want to say thank you so much for your time, for sharing your insights with us students. I'm really looking forward to working with you in the future and to the next interview with one of our incredible ASU supply chain management faculty.
Thank you, Nathaniel. It's been a pleasure and always love doing this. So thank you very much. Thank you for joining the Chain Reaction Podcast, brought to you by the Department of Supply Chain Management at Arizona State University's WP Carey School of Business. Our Chain Reaction Podcast producers are Nadia Flores, Chris Lee, and Eddie Davila. A special thank you for the continued support of the staff and faculty of Arizona State University's WP Carey School of Business in bringing these podcasts to you. Please reach out to us at wpcarey.sem@asu.edu with any SCM news and concepts you would like us to discuss in a future installment of the Chain Reaction Podcast. Also, remember to check out the Supply Chain Management website. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again for our next Chain Reaction release.